Okay, welcome to Wednesday night Bible study. We are studying the life of Solomon. This is the fourth installment. I think you're going to enjoy this tonight. There's a really interesting backstory we're going to look at. There is some biblical archaeology that proves the Bible story, and of course, some maps. I always like maps. My wife, back when we had paper maps before GPS, my wife used to call me Map Man, because I had a lot of maps. I think she thought I was going to be buried with all my maps one of these days. Anyway, so we'll have some maps. I like to kind of help us visualize kind of where things happened, and I think it helps us understand the story. So, quick review. We're calling this From Promise to Preparation because God's promise was that to David that Solomon would build the temple. And so tonight we're going to start the preparation of building Solomon's temple. So 2 lessons ago, young Solomon became king. We said he was about 18 or 19 years old. He was the third king of Israel. It says he loved God. And it also said that he wasn't perfect in his worship. And I thought, well, that's probably kind of like us. We can love God and we're just imperfect people. So, but in spite of that, God came to him and said, I'm going to give you anything you want. What do you want? And his answer was, I want wisdom and discernment so I can govern your people. So already Solomon had it right that these were not his people. These were God's people. Israel was a nation of 3.5 or 4 million people. So we likened that to having the state of Oklahoma with an 18-year-old governor. So he needs a lot of wisdom. So God said, I'll give that to you. And since you did not ask for honor, you did not ask for riches, I will give that to you also. And so he promised him more wisdom than any other human before or after, and greater riches and honor than any human before or after. And then last lesson, we showed how Solomon started using his wisdom. First, he created a cabinet of advisors. Each one of those advisors was over a different part of government, very much like the cabinets we have in our government today. Then also, because he, over the time, had created such a huge administration and palace, he was feeding 4,000 to 5,000 people a day in his palace and administration. Plus, it says he had 12,000 chariot horses, and so it takes a lot of food for that on a daily basis. So he divided Israel up into 12 districts, and he didn't follow tribal lines, but he divided them in 12 districts. Each district had a governor or administrator, and so 1 month a year, each district was to supply the food for the palace and also for the horses and the horsemen. And all that had to be fresh daily because, as you know, they had no electricity or refrigeration. So you think about the amount of food that would take. Anyway, so tonight we're going to look at From Promise to Preparation. Now, we've mentioned how 2nd Chronicles and 1st Kings have a lot of overlap. They're what's called parallel scriptures. So tonight, 2 Kings chapter 5 and 2 Chronicles chapter 2 are basically the same story, but they each tell a little bit different aspect of it. And so we'll be going back and forth between the two to try to get the complete, a coherent narrative that we can understand this. Okay, let's start off there on your lesson sheet with 1 Kings 5, verse 1. King Hiram of Tyre had always been a loyal friend of David. When Hiram learned that David's son Solomon was the new king of Israel, he sent ambassadors there to greet him. So if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 5, back when we were going through 2 Samuel previously, through the life of David, we learned that Hiram, king of Tyre, had sent craftsmen and cedar to help King David build his palace. Now, Hiram was a pagan king, but obviously he had great respect for David, and so he wants to continue this alliance with young Solomon. Now, we're going to take the detour I talked about. When I started reading about Hiram and Tyre, I thought, well, I want to learn about who these folks are. What country is this? And so that's what we're going to look at for a second. So first of all, let's look at a map. Do you have the other map? There we go. Okay, let me point out some things here. Okay, so this is northern Israel. That's the Sea of Galilee right there. So this would be the country of Phoenicia. And so Tyre is this little island here, and so the city of Tyre was on this island that's 1.5 miles long by 1.5 miles wide, plus there was part of the city was on the coast, so the city was in both places. The island was totally fortified. There was a huge wall around it, so it was very, very protected. And then a couple of other cities I want you to pay attention to. Here's Sidon. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Then here's Byblos, also called Gebal. We'll talk about that later in the lesson. Now, this is current-day Lebanon. You may have heard of Beirut. So this little outcropping here is where the current-day Beirut, Lebanon is. In the news right now, you hear about Hezbollah, and so they have encampments in Lebanon. And so Hezbollah is a ally of Iran. They're a terrorist organization, so Israel is trying to take care of Hezbollah there. Okay, and then show that other map now. Okay, to give you an idea, so purple is Phoenicia. So here's that Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, and then it goes farther north. The green would be Solomon's kingdom. So Israel is right here, but Solomon was actually over these countries around. They were vassals, as we noted last time, who were subservient kings to Solomon. So here's Jerusalem, and then pay attention, here's Joppa. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So you can kind of see see how close they were to each other. They're about 100 miles from here down to Joppa. So you can kind of see that's not a tremendously big country. Okay, so Phoenicia was known for a couple things. They were outstanding craftsmen in all the building trades, and also they were great seafaring traders. Bring up the ship there. Okay, so this is an ancient stone carving from the time around Phoenicia was a great country, and this shows what the Phoenician ships look like. And then we have a picture of a replica that's been made, and so it looks exactly like the stone carving. Okay, and then bring up the next map. And so at the time that our lesson is tonight, Phoenicia was a weaker country than Israel, but they were still allies. So Phoenicia reached its height of power about 250 years later. And so at that time, of course, Israel had gone into a divided kingdom, so it was much weaker. So at 700 years before Christ, which is where this map is, Israel is a divided kingdom, but Phoenicia is at its height in power. So when it was in height, its power. So here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Spain, Europe, Africa. So Phoenicia's here. And so these are all the trade routes. The red are the colonies. So Phoenicia was so strong they had actually had colonies all over the Mediterranean Sea. And they had trade routes throughout. So they were very, very powerful 700 BC, which is about 250 years after tonight's story. Over here, this is 800 BC. So this is when Israel had divided. So here's Judah, here's Israel, and then there's Phoenicia. This map is about 100 years later, about 700 BC. So what happened to Phoenicia? So Solomon's reign is 970 to 930 BC. So when you're before Christ, BC, your numbers are getting smaller as you go towards Christ. So Solomon's 970 to 930. We mentioned that map there is about 700 BC. And what we know is that Nebuchadnezzar, about 585 BC, destroyed the coastal city of Tyre, he was unable to conquer that walled island. He didn't have the means to do that. And so the next thing we know about Tyre, about that walled island, there's a historian, Diodorus. He said that 250 years after Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, in 332 years before Christ, he was coming through and wiping out all the little kingdoms so he could be the king over the world. And he came to that walled city of Tyre that was on that island, and he had to figure out a way he could finally defeat that. And so his men found that island was a half mile off the coast. His men found a shoal, kind of like a sandbar, I guess you'd call it, 18 feet under the water that went all the way out to that island. So Alexander the Great had his men take the debris, all the building stones, the timber, dirt from the destroyed city of the coastal city of Tyre that Nebuchadnezzar had totally destroyed, had them take all that and form a causeway out to the island so that he could roll his siege equipment out to the island. So go ahead and go to the next image. Okay, so this is the site of the coastal city of Tyre destroyed by the Babylonians. Here's the walled island city of Tyre that's a half a mile, and this a mole is a causeway. So this is an example of the causeway built by Alexander so that he could take his siege equipment and knock down that wall and get into the city. What's interesting is over the years, because that has blocked the sea, silt has filled that in, so the present coastline today is right there. Okay, next picture. Okay, so here's another picture. There's Alexander the Great's dam or causeway right there. Next picture. Okay, this is some of the remainder of that causeway that Alexander the Great built in 332 BC. I don't think our roads last that long. Okay, next picture. Okay, so this is an example of an ancient siege engine, they would call it. So he built that causeway, and the causeway was 200 feet wide. So he could roll these siege engines out, and so that would allow his men to get into the city, and then often they would also have battering rams to knock the walls down. Okay, next picture. This is an aerial view of the current city of Tyre, which has been rebuilt. So this was the island. That's where Alexander's causeway was, and it's been filled in. Now there's buildings all over it. Isn't that interesting? Okay. Now, what makes this interesting? Isaiah and Ezekiel both prophesied the destruction of Tyre. So the entire Isaiah chapter 23, Isaiah made this prophecy at the height of Tyre's strength, so about 700 BC. And he prophesied that Tyre would be destroyed. I've got just 2 or 3 verses there on your lesson sheet. Isaiah 23:1. It says, "This message came to me concerning Tyre. Wail, you trading ships of Tarshish, for the harbor and the houses of Tyre are gone. The rumors you heard in Cyprus are true." And then you can read the whole chapter. I didn't want to put that on the lesson sheet. And so he doesn't say exactly when it's going to happen, but then you come down to Ezekiel chapter 26, and let's read some of that on your lesson sheet. It says, "Therefore," and Ezekiel made his prophecy somewhere around 590 BC. So this is before Nebuchadnezzar came to Tyre. So this is just a few years before Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am your enemy, O Tyre, and I will bring many nations, so that's more than one, against you, like the waves of the sea crashing your shoreline. From the north I will bring King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon against Tyre. He is King of kings and brings his horses, chariots, charioteers, and great army. He will destroy your mainland village. So Ezekiel first, so he's got a two-part prophecy. The first part is Nebuchadnezzar is coming, and that happens just a few years after he says it. And he names the king, and he says exactly what he's going to do. Then later in that chapter, verse 12 on your lesson sheet, they will destroy your lovely homes and dump your stones and timbers and even your dust into the sea. I will make your island a bare rock, a place for fishermen to spread their nets. So Ezekiel, about 5 years before Nebuchadnezzar does it, predicts that Nebuchadnezzar by name is going to destroy the mainland city, and then 250 years later, Alexander the Great does exactly what Ezekiel said in dumping the stones and the timbers and the dirt from the mainland into the sea so the island can be. Isn't that amazing? So this is when I read all that, this is the thought I had. If I was a Jew and I read that, I would think, those prophets pretty accurate. I would have to ask myself, if Jesus had well over 300 exact prophecies about him in the Old Testament, how come I don't believe in Jesus? That's what I thought about. To me, that's amazing. That's amazing. So these are prophecies that actually occurred within the time frame of the Old Testament. Okay, so that's your backstory tonight. So let's go on to 1 Kings 5, 2 and 3. So after the ambassadors from all the kings from Hiram came to congratulate, Solomon sends a letter back to him, I guess, with them to go back to Tyre. Solomon sent this message back to Hiram: you know that my father David was not able to build a temple to honor the name of the Lord his God because of the many wars waged against him by the surrounding nations. He could not build until the Lord gave him victory over all his enemies. And so, back then they didn't have paper. So what they used was papyrus. And so there's a picture of papyrus, and this is made in Egypt. And the Egyptians did a very good job of making this into flat pieces of, it wasn't, parchment is not papyrus, but we would kind of think of it that way. But this is what papyrus, you can actually buy it today, but it was used by all the ancient peoples for writing. So this is what Solomon would use to write a letter to the ambassadors of Hiram to take back to him. Because travel was difficult, and kings didn't like to leave their land for fear of coups that would happen while they were gone. And travel was long, and now we have jet planes, and you can get there fast and get back fast. And, they didn't have any electronic method of communication, so it's all letters. And really, if you think about it, it's not just ancient time, but even up till fairly recent times. I know when I was in Nigeria working in the jungle in the mission hospital, the only communication we had with the outside world was airmail letters. This is what you would buy. It was made out of very thin paper, much like the paper your Bible pages are made out of, and maybe some of you used these years ago. And you could write as much as you could on that. Then you had to fold it up and lick it and stick it. There was no envelope. And then you'd travel a couple hours to the nearest post office through the potholes and the little windy roads through the through the jungle, and it would arrive in America 2 or 3 weeks later. And then family or friends would buy one of those in America, send it back, and we'd get it 2 or 3 weeks later. So our communication was 4 to 6 weeks. And that was not too long ago. Of course, nowadays, pretty much cell phones are everywhere, and electronics and technology has caught up. But back then, in the time of Solomon and Hiram, it was very slow, just like that. So Solomon starts off this verse saying, Hiram, you know. In other words, I'm sure David and Hiram had visited about why David, it was David's deep desire to build a temple for God. And yet God told him, no, you're a man of war. We're going to let your son do that. And so notice that Solomon is talking about building the temple to honor the name of the Lord. And that's going to come up several times in our lesson tonight, because why would he say that? The word name is the representation of a character. And so your name is not you. Your name is not you, but your name represents you and represents your character, represents the essence of who you are. And so the same thing with the name of God. The name of God is not God, but it represents God. And so throughout this you'll hear Solomon talk about building a temple for the name, for the representation of God. Now we're just going to do a quick flashback there on 1 Chronicles 22. This is actually right before David passed away, and he called his son Solomon in and gave him the charge to build the temple. Then David sent for his son Solomon and instructed him to build a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel. My son, I wanted to build a temple to honor the name of the Lord my God, David told him. But the Lord said to me, you have killed many men in battles that you have fought. And since you have shed so much blood in my sight, you will not be the one to build a temple to honor my name. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace. I will give him peace with all his enemies and in the surrounding lands. His name will be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel during his reign. He is the one who will build a temple to honor my name. And he will be my son, and I will be his father. And I will secure the throne of his kingdom forever. And so David had called young Solomon in and told him what God had revealed to him years earlier. Okay, let's see. Let's go to 1 Kings 5, verse 4 and 5. Okay, so this is Solomon continuing in the letter to Hiram. But now the Lord my God has given me peace, and some versions say rest, on every side. I have no enemies, and all is well. So I'm planning to build a temple to honor the name of the Lord my God, just as he instructed my father David. For the Lord told him, your son, whom I will place on your throne, will build the temple to honor my name. And so Solomon here is speaking back to a promise of God that God made through Moses to the children of Israel. Here they are in the wilderness, and they're not at a time of rest or peace. But he said there'll come a time when you get into the promised land, you will have that rest and that peace. Let's look at that Deuteronomy 12, 9 through 10. Because you have not yet arrived at the place of rest, the land the Lord your God is giving you as your special possession. But you will soon cross the Jordan River and live in the land your Lord your God is giving you, when he gives you rest from all your enemies and you're living safely in the land. So finally, 500 years after coming into the promised land, they now have this rest, this peace. They have this peace from all their enemies, and it's all under Solomon. So it took 500 years after they got into promised land to see the rest that God had promised for them. And we know as Christians that this rest for God's people under Solomon was simply a shadow or a forerunner of the eternal rest that we have in Jesus Christ. There on your lesson sheet, read Hebrews 4, 8 through 11. If Joshua had succeeded in giving them rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest, still to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter into that rest. Okay, now we mentioned how Solomon kept referring to building the temple for God's name. I've included the next verse here from 2 Chronicles 5 and 6 to show that he recognizes that God is not going to be contained in that temple. You see, because in the cultures of that day, we've mentioned how every nation kind of had their gods, had their little g gods. And they built temples to all these little g gods, and they considered those gods to live within those temples. So they would go to those temples and do the idol worship thing. But we're going to read verses here in 2 Chronicles 2, where Solomon shows us that he knows that God will not be actually living in and contained in the temple that would be built. Okay, verses 5 and 6 of 2 Chronicles 2. This is, again, Solomon in the letter to Hiram. This must be a magnificent temple because our God is greater than all other gods. But who can really build him a worthy home? Not even the highest heavens can contain him. So who am I to consider building a temple for him except as a place to burn sacrifices to him? So Solomon's saying, I'm simply building a temple for the name of God so I can have a place to worship him, but he is not contained within this temple. He says, not even the highest heavens can contain him. Okay, so let's, 1 Kings 5 and 6, Solomon is continuing the letter. Therefore, please command, he's asking Hiram, please command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. Let my men work alongside yours, and I will pay your men whatever wages you ask. As you know, there's no one among us who can cut timber like you Sidonians. Okay, so bring up a map. Okay, there we go. So this is Lebanon, and this map, the green area shows the forest of Lebanon where the great cedars grew. And so we mentioned this is Beirut here. So Sidon is about the south end of these forest areas. So this is where the lumberjacks lived. Down here would be Tyre. So Solomon wants the very finest lumber available for the temple. And so he's asking him for wood, for lumber from the cedars of Lebanon, and also for Hiram to provide his servants who know how to harvest this massive wood. And he said, and Solomon's saying, I'll send some of my servants to work with yours. And he said, I'm going to pay for both of them. But Hiram, he said, you can set the wages for your men, but I'll pay the wages. And he said, you Sidonians, the men of Sidon, you're the best lumberjacks there are. That's what y'all do. So notice Solomon's wisdom here. Number one, his humility. He's king of a greater nation at that time than what Phoenicia was. But he's showing humility because he's openly acknowledging that Israel doesn't have the lumberjack skills that Phoenicia has. And so this is simply showing us that a wise leader like Solomon, he's not a know-it-all. He openly admits what he doesn't know, and he openly admits where he needs help, and he seeks that help from people that can give it to him. And then the second thing is to notice, besides his humility, is his fairness. You know, here the stronger Israelite king is deferring to the weaker Gentile king to set the payment and terms of what the Israelite king will pay the Gentile king's workers. And Solomon could have just said, this is what I'm going to do. But no, he said, you set the wages and I'll pay them. So this way he's showing trust, and also he's showing that he's not going to exploit people that are weaker than him. Okay, now let's look at a picture of a cedar of Lebanon. Okay, this is a dark picture. Okay, these are people right here. Okay, see that? See that tree? These trees can be up to 120 feet tall. Okay, this is, I believe, Pastor, 44 feet to the ceiling here. So a tree 3 times as tall as this auditorium. They can be, you can see how big they can be. Just tremendous, tremendous, tremendous trees. And so these are all in the forest areas of Lebanon. And so the cedars of Lebanon are mentioned many times in the Old Testament. They're also used as just a metaphor for power, strength, and majesty. You know, I remember when I was a kid, I had an aunt that had a cedar closet. Any of y'all remember those? Little closet where you'd keep your sweaters made out of wool, so the moths wouldn't get into them and things like that. And I'd love to go stand in that closet and shut the door and just smell it, you know, because cedar is very aromatic. Also, it's very durable. Also, it's resistant to rot and insects. And so that was the type of lumber that was famous throughout the ancient world for building. It was the finest lumber available. Okay, now let's look at 2 Chronicles 2:11 through 12. So Hiram sends a letter back to Solomon, and we're going to kind of go back and forth as we try to get this whole picture, but this is part of Hiram's letter he sent back to Solomon. King Hiram sent this letter reply to Solomon. It is because the Lord loves his people that he has made you their king. Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who made the heavens and the earth. This is a pagan king talking. He has given King David a wise son, gifted with discretion and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal palace for himself. So Hiram is enthusiastically praising Solomon. He says he's a wise man. He's impressed by his wisdom. And then he says, praise the Lord. And he's not, you know, there's several names for God. We've gone through those in the past. He's not using a generic El or Elohim God, but he uses Yahweh here, who is the covenant God of Israel. So he's praising the covenant God of Israel. And then he says, the God who made heavens and the earth. So we don't know. I mean, we have no idea, but we do know that most of these pagan gods were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. So perhaps, I'm guessing, that through his association with King David, that Hiram had gotten some degree of belief in the Israeli God, even though he wasn't convinced he was the only God. But obviously he was, just to say such things, I can't imagine he just doing it to impress Solomon. Anyway, so he obviously had great respect for the Israel, and I'm sure he'd witnessed all the military victories that David had, even when it didn't seem like he had a chance. So he had been impressed with the work of Israel's God. And then he says Solomon is a wise, understanding, and discreet young man. And so Hiram has figured out that he doesn't just know a lot of stuff, but he's very wise. I mean, you can know a lot of stuff and not be wise. But Solomon, you know, we've talked about all the things that he knew, all the things that he did, and also he was wise and discreet. So he was a great king. Okay, 1 Kings 5:8 through 9. Okay, and this is Hiram again speaking. I have received your message, and I will supply all of the cedar and cypress timber that you need. My servants will bring the logs from the Lebanon mountains to the Mediterranean Sea and make them into rafts and float them along the coast to whatever place you choose. Then we will break the rafts apart so you can carry the logs away. You can pay me by supplying me with food for my household. Okay, and then the 2 Chronicles part of that same letter says, we will cut whatever timber you need from the Lebanon mountains and float the logs in rafts down the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to Joppa. From there you can transport the logs up to Jerusalem. Okay, so bring the map up. Okay, so this is Jerusalem here. This is that Via Maris that we talked about, the road by the sea, great trade route. We talked about that 2 lessons ago. Okay, here is Tyre. So here is Sidon's up here. Here's the forest. So Hiram's men would get the logs to the sea. I suppose they would have to break them up, obviously, if they're 12 stories high. And then they would float them in rafts down to Joppa. So Joppa is right here. That is the primary seacoast port for Israel. So it's about 30 miles from Joppa to Israel. So about 100 miles from here to here and about 30 miles from here to here. Okay, so bring up the next picture. Okay, this is the archaeological proof. This is a stone carving, it's called a relief, that has been dated to the time of Solomon. And what do you see? You see Phoenician boats pulling logs in the sea. See the fish? So this confirms the Bible account. Pretty neat, huh? One more of thousands archaeology facts that have confirmed the Bible. Okay, now we're going to go down and see what David offered to pay Hiram. Remember when we read this, last time we talked about how one cor, C-O-R, is one donkey load, how much one donkey could carry. And then when you read about one bath as a liquid measure, one bath was 5.8 gallons. Okay, let's read 2 Chronicles 2:10. Okay, so this is what Solomon promised to give Hiram's servants for doing all this work. I will give your servants, the woodsmen who cut the timber, 20,000 cores of ground wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of olive oil. Now, if you look up to 1 Kings 5:8-9, Hiram says, supplying me for food with my household. So apparently this was enough, not just for Hiram's household, but also for all the woodmen. So it's combined, and this is an annual payment of David to Hiram for all the work that's being done and for the timbers themselves. So let's talk about how much that is. So 20,000 cores, so 20,000 donkey loads. We mentioned how one donkey load is about 5 bushels, so that's 100,000 bushels of each of wheat and barley annually. So that's about 2,000 bushels a week. And you get 20,000 baths of wine and olive oil, so that's about 2,000 gallons a week. But obviously there's lots of people working, obviously, to eat all this food and drink all this wine and use all that olive oil. And then if you go back to 1 Kings 5, we'll not read it, but it says the olive oil is called beaten olive oil. So it's not just the standard grade of olive oil from crushing olives with stone, but beaten olive oil is hand-pressed olive oil. And that's the finest grade of olive oil in the ancient time that they would use for the tabernacle oil lamps. And so that's what Solomon is giving Hiram the very best of the best because of what Hiram is doing for Israel. Okay, 2 Chronicles 2:7. Okay, so this is back to Solomon's letter, this is something else that Solomon is requesting Hiram. Because like I said, Phoenicians were known for tremendous tradesmanship and workmanship in all areas. So Solomon says, "Send me therefore a man skilled to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, and in purple, crimson, and blue yarn, and experienced in the art of engraving, to work in Judah and Jerusalem with my skilled workers, whom my father David provided." And so he's requesting a master craftsman because he knows he needs somebody who is the best of the best at all these different skills, and asking if there's one person he can send to kind of be the overseer of Solomon's craftsmen. And so, I mean, that's amazing. One person can know about gold, silver, bronze, iron, and then he mentions purple, crimson, and blue yarn. So these are dyes. Purple, crimson, and blue were the dyes used in the temple for the high priest's clothing, for the curtains, and they were all extremely expensive because, you know, if you look around here, we got all different colors of clothes on. Dyes are not expensive now. Back then, everybody's clothes were the same color because that's no color, basically, whatever yarn it was made out of. But, a sign of wealth was to have color in your clothes, and blue and purple and red were the colors they could get from nature. So bring up this is the Kermes scale insect, and so this is on a tree trunk here. So this is a scale insect, and so when the female dies, they would collect these dead bodies of the female insects, and they could squeeze them and get the red dye out. So that's how you would have to get red dye. Okay, so the next picture. Okay, this is a sea snail, and this gland here is full of purple liquid. So this is where they would get purple and also the bluish tint dyes also. So that's where they would get the dyes for the high priest clothes and the curtains and things like that in the temple. And also that's where the wealthy people would get dyes for their clothes. But that's how hard it was to get dye, and that's why it's so expensive. Somebody had to dive down into the sea and find those particular snails and then bring them up, and you could get, a little bit per snail. Okay, so here's Hiram's response to that request of Solomon, 2 Chronicles 2:13 and 14. "I'm sending you Hirumabai, a man of great skill, whose mother was from Dan, and whose father was from Tyre." So his mother was an Israelite, his father was a Phoenician. "He is trained to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, and with purple, blue, and crimson yarn and fine linen. He's experienced in all kinds of engraving and can execute any design you give him. He will work with your skilled workers and with those of my Lord David, and with those of my Lord David, your father." So bring up a map. Okay, so here's Phoenicia. And so this is the map we saw earlier. Here's Tyre here, here's Sidon, here's the mountains where the forests were. Okay, this is the northern part of Israel. One of the northernmost cities in Israel is Dan, right there. So Hiram's, the craftsman's mother was from Dan, his father was from Tyre, but you went by the nationality of your father, and so he's considered a Phoenician. Okay, and then let's read 13 and 14. "Then King Solomon conscripted a labor force of 30,000 men from all Israel He sent them to Lebanon in ships, 10,000 every month, so each man would be 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of his labor force. And so this is sort of like a lot of our oil field workers now. Some of them go overseas for a month and they're home for a month. They go overseas for a month, and other ones, so someone's there all the time. Or a lot of the folks, men around here will actually work in West Texas, and they'll work a couple of weeks down there and come home for a week or two and then back, and then others do the same. So Solomon's doing the same thing here to that's how he got a labor force from the Israel men. Now, these were not slaves. He was paying them to do this, but he conscripted them, and then one of the members of his cabinet that we read about last time was in charge of the labor force. Okay, and then 2 Chronicles 17 through 18. Solomon took a census of all the foreigners in the land of Israel, like the census his father had taken, and he counted 153,600. He assigned 70,000 of them as common laborers, 80,000 as quarry workers, and 3,600 as foremen. So now he said, we need more workers. So he has a census of all the people in Israel that are not Israelites. And so a lot of these people are Canaanites who are, descendants of the men of Canaan that were never destroyed, that they're living among Israel. A lot of these are immigrants who come into Israel looking for a better life because Israel was a good country to be in. So he counts them and says, okay, these men are 70,000 going to be burden bearers, so they're going to help the transport of the lumber and the cut stone and the supplies. 80,000 are stone cutters working the quarries. And then 3,600 he appointed to be the overseers of this entire group. Okay, and then 1 Kings 5:17, at the king's command they quarried large blocks of high-quality stone and shaped them to make the foundation of the temple. Later on, a couple chapters in the future, it'll talk about these stones. They were, it says 8 to 10 cubits long, so that's 12 to 15 feet long. These stones, they're massive stones. And there has been some archaeology around the Temple Mount, not a lot because the Muslims control a lot of that, but they found some of these stones at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that were quarried and shaped for Solomon's temple. And the next chapter we'll read says that there was no sound of an iron tool at the building of the temple site. So all of these stones had to be hewn at the site where they were quarried, and they were transported to Jerusalem. Okay, the last verse, the craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and the workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and the stone for the building of the temple. So what impressed me about this whole chapter was that to build God's house, it required an international coalition of craftsmen. And the last interesting note here is it says the workers from Byblos, they were known as stone cutters. The other thing about Byblos that was famous, Byblos as a seaport was the main, they would import papyrus from Egypt, and then they would distribute it out as the Phoenicians, had a lot of trade ships. So the trade ships from Byblos would go all over the Mediterranean taking this papyrus. And one of the places they would take it would be to Greece. And so over the centuries, the Greeks began to refer to papyrus as Byblos because they would make books out of this. Now, a papyrus book is just a stack of papyrus that they would bind together because the old scroll method, over time they would crack too much. And so just kind of like we refer to facial tissue often as Kleenex, they would refer to papyrus as Byblos because that was their books. So we get the word Bible from Byblos because the Greeks referred to papyrus as Byblos. It would be a book of books. So that's where we get the word Bible from. Anyway, so to close out tonight, looking at this chapter, I think it's like a type and a shadow of the New Testament church. Let me tell you how I came to that conclusion. So if you look at Solomon, it said he was the king of peace. Remember, his name, Solomon, came from shalom, the Jewish word for peace. And we read throughout this chapter how God wanted him to build the temple because he was going to be a king of peace. There was no war during Solomon's term. And so Jesus was a king of peace. And so Solomon was a type or a shadow of Jesus as the king of peace. Isaiah chapter 9, the prophet Isaiah says the Messiah will be a prince of peace. In John 14, near the end of his life, Jesus said to his disciples, "My peace I give to you." So we should have the peace of Jesus in our heart, the peace that passes understanding. So Solomon was tasked with building God's house. Old Testament prophets and the New Testament speak of Jesus as the cornerstone of God's house. God's house is the church. And then Peter calls us living stones to build God's house on the cornerstone, Jesus. And that's his church. So when you look back and see what Solomon did to build God's house, he didn't just use Israelites. He used Phoenicians, and then he used people from all over the world. All these immigrants that had come to Israel, all these different Canaanite tribes. So here you have people building God's house who, different skin color, different language, different backgrounds, different politics, different races, but they all came together to build the magnificent temple that was God's house, Solomon's temple. And so Jesus Christ, in the Great Commission, says go into all the world, not just go to your area of the country where people think like you and look like you, but go into all the world, because I want people from all nations to be living stones to build God's house, to build the church. So that's what I thought about when I looked at this chapter, that this is a type and shadow of what the New Testament church is supposed to be. All right, let's stand and we'll have our closing prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this time we can look at your word and learn from it, Father, and see how archaeology has proven your word, to see the wisdom of your word, to see how the Old Testament is a shadow of the New Testament, and Father, just how we can be better representatives of yours. Father, give us each wisdom, give us discernment, so that in all areas of our life that we can be the best representatives of you, and that we can glorify your name through our lives. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.